In March of 1982, the entire Gonzales County, Texas, laughed at Margaret Holloway. They laughed at the feed store in Nixon. They laughed at the counter at the Dairy Queen. They laughed in the Methodist church parking lot after Wednesday evening Bible study. They laughed at the cattle auction in Cuero. The widow Holloway had gone to a nursery auction in Yoakum and bought 400 eucalyptus saplings from an Argentine man named Calvin Ruiz for $160. She was going to plant every single one, not along the hedgerow, not along the fence line, not near the house, in the middle of the pasture, in the middle of a working cattle pasture. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. The woman was grieving. Frank Holloway had died in February of 1980, heart attack, 43 years old. He had left the ranch to his widow, and now the widow was planting decorative trees in the middle of the cow pasture. The county laughed for 3 months. Then they laughed for 6 more years. They stopped laughing in the summer of 1988, when the worst drought in 40 years burned through South Texas, when ranchers in 4 surrounding counties started selling off herds that their grandmothers had built, and when somebody noticed something. There was one ranch in Gonzales County where the grass was still green, where the cattle still had shade, where the trees the whole county had called a joke were, in that summer, the only thing that made sense across the whole region. Let me take you back 6 years. Let me show you what she planted. Let me show you who laughed. At the nursery auction in Yoakum, DeWitt County, Texas, on that Saturday in March of 1982, Calvin Ruiz had the saplings in 1-gallon pots lined up on 3 folding tables at the back of the auction barn. He had been there since 6 in the morning. By 11, not a single person had stopped at his tables. A few men had walked past and made comments to each other that Calvin pretended not to hear. Calvin Ruiz had emigrated from Argentina in 1968. He had come to Texas with a single suitcase and 7 pounds of eucalyptus seed. He had spent the last 14 years trying to sell these trees to Texas ranchers without success. That morning in Yoakum, he had decided silently that this would be his last auction. He was going to go home, sell the greenhouse, and stop propagating the species. 14 years is too long to keep knocking on a door nobody is going to open. Margaret Holloway stopped at his tables at 11:15. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. She wrote him a check for $160, 40 cents per sapling. She loaded all 400 into the bed of a 1974 Ford F-250 and drove them 63 miles back to her ranch outside of Nixon. And within 48 hours, Gonzales County had a new story to tell. Margaret Holloway bought 400 Argentine shade trees to plant in her cow pasture. Understand what the saplings looked like in March of 1982. They were thin like a pencil, some of them thinner than that. Most of them were 18 inches tall, a few pushing 24. They had 4 or 5 leaves each, sickle-shaped and silver green, and the leaves smelled sharp when you crushed them between your fingers. Menthol, cough drops. Nothing you'd associate with a ranch pasture in South Texas. The root balls were the size of a man's fist. The stems were pale and flexible and would bend 90 degrees without snapping. A few of them had a small aphid problem. Tiny black dots clustered on the undersides of the newest leaves. 3 of the pots had a spider that had built a web between the sapling and the rim. They did not look like trees. They looked like something a gardener might plant in a flower bed next to a porch, something decorative, something that belonged in a suburban yard in Houston, maybe, where the woman of the house would water it with a garden hose, and the children would knock it over while playing ball. They did not look like anything that belonged in a cow pasture in Gonzales County, where the grass was native bluestem and buffalo grass, where the mesquite and huisache had to be bulldozed every 3 years to keep the land open, where the cattle were Angus and Brangus and Beefmaster, and where the whole economy of the place ran on one simple calculation: pounds of beef per acre of grass. Trees were something you cleared. Trees were not something you planted. Every man in Gonzales County knew this. It was as settled a fact as the direction of sunrise. Margaret Holloway had bought 400 trees to plant in a cow pasture. Calvin Ruiz himself almost tried to talk her out of it. "Margaret, I don't think you understood what I was telling you earlier. These trees get big. They get tall. They'll shade out your grass in places. This is not the usual." "I understood you," Margaret said. "You want to plant all 400? Not just a few along the fence line? In the pastures, spaced out, not in rows." Calvin looked at her for a long moment. He had been trying to sell these trees for 14 years. He had sold 6 or 7 here and there to people who wanted a shade tree for a backyard. He had never sold 400 at once. He had never sold them to someone who was going to put them in a working pasture. "Ma'am," he said, "I am going to be honest with you. I don't want your check if this is a mistake. I'll take these home and try again next year." Margaret folded the check and put it in his shirt pocket. "Mr. Ruiz, I know what I'm doing. I spent 3 summers at a ranch in the province of Corrientes when I was younger. I have seen exactly this arrangement work on native grass in a hotter climate than this one. Your trees are coming home with me." Calvin didn't argue again. Her brother-in-law, Ray, was there at the sale. He had driven over with her that morning, and he had been wandering the other lots while Margaret talked to Calvin. He came back just as Margaret was writing the check. He looked at the saplings. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Calvin. He looked back at the saplings. "Maggie," he said, "what in the world are you doing?" "Buying trees, Ray." "For what?" "For the pastures." Ray took off his cap. He was 56 years old. He had been ranching in Gonzales County his entire adult life. He ran 400 head of Angus on 800 acres east of Smiley. He was her late husband Frank's older brother, and since Frank had died in February of 1980, Ray had been driving out to her place once a week, whether she asked him to or not. "Margaret," he said, "you're going to shade out half your grass. You know that, right? You know what a tree does to a pasture?" "I know exactly what a tree does to a pasture." "Then why?" "I'll tell you in 7 years, Ray." Ray looked at Calvin Ruiz, who was watching this exchange without expression. He looked at the 400 little green things in their little black pots. Frank would have never done this. "Frank's not here to do it," Margaret said. "And I am." The story was at the feed store in Nixon by Tuesday morning. Margaret Holloway bought 400 shade trees from that Argentine fellow, going to plant them in her pastures. Every single one of them. It was at the co-op in Smiley by Wednesday afternoon, and by Thursday it had reached the cattle auction in Cuero, 20 miles south, where a man named Dale Purdy heard the story while buying a replacement heifer. Dale Purdy had known Frank Holloway since grade school. He didn't laugh when he heard it. He just shook his head slowly and said, "Frank's not even cold yet, and she's planting trees in the pasture." By Friday, the story had made it to the diner in Nixon, the Methodist church parking lot after the ladies' Wednesday Bible study, the line at the feed mill, and the booth at the back of the Dairy Queen, where 4 of the older ranchers sat every morning at 7:30, drinking coffee that was too hot and talking about weather that wasn't cooperating. At the Dairy Queen, a man named Lowell Watts delivered the definitive verdict. "She's grieving," he said. "That's all this is. Frank's been dead 2 years, and now she's lost her mind. Gonna be a train wreck out there by fall." The other 3 nodded. They had seen this kind of thing before, widows making strange decisions. It was sad, but it was predictable. In 6 months, there would be an auction at the Holloway place. The land would go to one of the neighbors. The cattle would be dispersed. The trees, if any were still alive, would be bulldozed by whoever bought the land. This was the story Gonzales County settled on. A widow, 40 years old, running her dead husband's ranch, making a decision that even the Argentine nursery man had tried to talk her out of. A woman planting trees in a cow pasture. The county repeated it the way small counties repeat things, at every gas station, at every fence line conversation, at every Sunday dinner for 3 months. Margaret Holloway heard about it, of course. There was no way not to. She said nothing. She planted the trees. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual judgment, stick with me. Because what Margaret Holloway built over the next 6 years is the kind of story that only makes sense when told from beginning to end, and the turnaround nobody saw coming is waiting at the end. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. Let me tell you about Margaret Holloway, because nothing she did next makes sense unless you know where she came from. Margaret was born Margaret Castellanos in 1942 in San Antonio. Her father, Eduardo Castellanos, had come to Texas in 1929 from the province of Corrientes in northeastern Argentina. He came on a cattle buying contract that was supposed to last 6 months. He stayed 51 years. Eduardo Castellanos had grown up on his uncle's estancia, a cattle ranch, 12,000 acres of native grass and scattered hardwood trees on the banks of the Paraná River. He had been working cattle since he was 9 years old. In Texas, he worked first as a foreman on a ranch near Pearsall, then as a livestock buyer for a company that serviced feedlots across South Texas. He married a Tajana woman named Adela in 1940. Margaret was their only child. Adela ran a small cafe in San Antonio through Margaret's whole childhood. Eduardo was gone for weeks at a time buying cattle. Margaret grew up in the cafe on weekdays and on a series of borrowed ranches on weekends when Eduardo was home and wanted to show his daughter where the money came from. She could castrate a calf by age 10. She could mix a mineral supplement by age 12. She kept the cafe's books by age 14, because Adela had a strong opinion that a woman who couldn't keep books was a woman who couldn't eat. In 1961, when Margaret was 19, Eduardo took her to Argentina for 3 summers in a row. Corrientes province, the same estancia he had grown up on. His cousin Hector was running it by then. Hector had rebuilt the operation after the war and was experimenting with something Eduardo had never seen in Texas. Cattle pastures with deliberately planted trees spread across them at measured intervals. Eucalyptus, grevillea. A few native hardwoods. The trees had been planted in 1954. By 1961 they were 20 feet tall, casting intermittent shade across grass that was greener and thicker than the unshaded pastures on the neighboring ranches. Hector showed Margaret the records. His cattle weighed between 11 and 14% more at the same age, on less water, with less supplemental feed. And he had shown her something else. Something Margaret would remember 16 years later, when the skies over South Texas stayed empty through a whole summer. Hector told her that in the drought year of 1958, when every ranch around his had lost 30 to 40% of their herds, his had lost 6%. Because the trees had kept the soil moisture under the canopies, because the shade had kept the cattle from overheating, because the leaf litter had kept feeding the grass roots when the rain stopped. Trees in a pasture, Hector said, are an insurance policy against the years when everything else fails. Margaret wrote it all down in a composition notebook she had bought at a pharmacy in San Antonio. She came back to Texas in August of 1963 and asked her father why nobody did this in South Texas. Eduardo told her the truth. Texas ranchers don't plant trees. Texas ranchers clear trees. It's a cultural thing. You could show them the numbers and they'd still call you crazy. Some things a man believes with his spine, not his head. Margaret kept the notebook. She married Frank Holloway in 1965 when she was 23. Frank had a 340-acre ranch outside Nixon that he had inherited from his father. Brangus cattle, good grass, no trees except the ones along the creek bottoms. Margaret brought the notebook with her. She showed it to Frank once in 1968. He read it carefully. He looked at her and said, "Maggie, if I plant trees in that pasture, My brother Ray will never speak to me again." She put the notebook in a drawer. She didn't bring it up again for 12 years. Frank died on February 9th, 1980, of a heart attack at the age of 43. He left Margaret the ranch, the cattle, an Alice Chalmers tractor from 1963, a Ford F-250 pickup, and a savings account with $18,000 in it. He also left her the composition notebook in the drawer. Margaret was 37 years old. She had no children. Her mother had died in 1974. Her father was living in a small house behind her cafe partner's home in San Antonio and was in declining health. She spent 1980 running the ranch the way Frank had run it. She spent 1981 reading every book on agroforestry that the Texas A&M Extension Office could get for her on interlibrary loan. She spent the winter of 1981 driving to College Station 4 times to sit in the library and photocopy research papers from Argentina, Brazil, and the south of Spain. She placed the order with Calvin Ruiz in February of 1982. She drove to the nursery auction in March. She did not tell Ray any of this. Here is what Gonzales County didn't know. Margaret had been planning this since the fall of 1980. 8 months after Frank died, she had made a drive she had told no one about. She had driven from Nixon to Corpus Christi, then south to Kingsville, where the King Ranch Research Station was. She had made an appointment with a pasture specialist named Dr. Samuel Breaux, a Cajun from Louisiana who had spent 12 years in South America studying cattle tree systems. She spent 6 hours with Dr. Breaux in his office. She showed him her father's composition notebook. She showed him the records Hector had kept at the estancia in Corrientes. She showed him her own ranch's soil survey, her rainfall records from the last 10 years, her cattle weights by age, her expenses, her pasture layout. Dr. Breaux told her 3 things. First, her soil was almost identical to the soil in Corrientes. Clay loam over a sandy subsoil, slightly alkaline, good drainage. Second, her rainfall was lower than Corrientes, 28 inches a year instead of 42, but it was consistent enough that the trees could establish themselves if she planted in late March after the spring rains. Third, the species she wanted was Eucalyptus camaldulensis, river red gum, because it could tolerate the drought cycles of South Texas, grow fast enough to provide useful shade within 4 years, and drop a leaf litter that broke down into the soil rather than acidifying it the way pine needles would. He gave her Calvin Ruiz's name. He told her Calvin had been propagating Eucalyptus camaldulensis from Argentine seed for years and couldn't sell the trees. Before she left his office, Dr. Breaux said one more thing to her. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "the question is not whether the trees will help your cattle in a normal year. They will. 3 or 4%, maybe 5. The question is what happens in the year the rain doesn't come. That's when you'll know if you built it right." Margaret wrote that down too. She spent the winter of 1980 and all of 1981 designing the planting pattern. She was not going to plant in rows. Rows were for timber plantations. She was going to plant in a pattern she had seen Hector use, a random scatter with a minimum spacing of 40 feet between trees, a maximum of 80 feet, across 4 specific pastures totaling 240 acres of her 340-acre ranch. 400 trees across 240 acres, less than 2 trees per acre. The pasture would still be a pasture. The grass would still be the dominant use. But within 5 to 7 years, the trees would be tall enough and broad enough to cast intermittent shade across the grass during the hottest hours of the day. She worked out the geometry on graph paper in Frank's old den. Each pasture mapped out. Each tree located. The water sources the cattle used marked in blue. The shade patterns projected forward 5, 7, 10 years. She did this work alone, at the kitchen table, between feedings, between fence repairs, between the other 1,000 obligations of running a ranch by yourself. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a widow buying decorative trees for a pasture. They were actually watching a woman execute a plan she had been working on for 19 months. She started planting on the morning of March 20th, 1982. She had 400 saplings in the back of the F-250. She had a post-hole digger. She had a shovel. She had a 55-gallon drum of water in the bed of the truck with a garden hose rigged through a hole in the side. She had 400 short wooden stakes she had cut the previous weekend in Frank's shop behind the house. She had the map. She started in the south pasture first. 120 acres of blue stem and buffalo grass, the pasture closest to the house, the one she could watch from her kitchen window. She paced off the first distance from the fence, 51 feet. She drove in a stake. She dug the first hole. The ground was hard. The post-hole digger didn't get through the first 8 inches without her standing on the crossbar and working it like a lever. The hole took her 11 minutes. The sapling went in. She packed the dirt around it with her boot. She ran water from the drum through the hose until the soil was saturated. She drove in the wooden stake next to the sapling and tied the stem to the stake with a strip of baling twine. 1 tree planted. 399 to go. She finished 6 trees the first day. She was exhausted by 3 in the afternoon. Her hands were blistered inside her leather gloves. She looked at the 5 little stakes and 1 sapling in the distance and realized that at this rate she would not finish the planting before the heat of summer killed the saplings she had put in the ground in March. That evening in Frank's shop, she pulled out his post-hole auger, the tractor-mounted one, powered off the PTO of the Alice Chalmers. It had not been used in 3 years. The gearbox was frozen. Let me tell you about that shop, because the shop is where the story of the trees really lived. Frank's shop had been his father's shop before him. Concrete floor, tin roof, a workbench along the east wall that Frank's father Walter had built in 1948 out of creosote-soaked bridge timber from a railroad bridge they had torn down in Gonzales County that year. A post vise bolted to the corner of the bench. Frank's grandfather had bought that vise in 1923 at a farm sale in San Marcos. It had been in constant use for 59 years by the time Margaret walked into the shop that evening in March of 1982. Margaret had not used the vise since Frank had died. She had not used most of the tools. She had kept the shop clean and the tools oiled, but she had hired a man named Ernesto Delgado from Nixon to come out and do what fence repairs and machinery work the ranch needed. Ernesto came on Tuesdays and Fridays for 2 years, but Margaret had watched Frank work in that shop for 15 years, and Frank had learned from his father Walter, who had been a better mechanic than he had ever admitted. Between the two of them, Margaret had picked up more than she had ever consciously tried to. She pulled the post-hole auger out of the corner of the shop. She cleaned the gearbox, replaced the shear pin, and re-oiled the bearings. She mounted the auger on the Alice Chalmers the next morning. The auger worked. She planted 41 trees the second day. By the end of the first week, she had 183 trees in the ground. By the end of the second week, all 400 were planted. She documented every tree in a new composition notebook. She used the fence lines as reference points and drew each pasture on its own page, each tree as a numbered dot, each dot cross-referenced to a line in the ledger where she had recorded the date planted, the species, the size at planting, and the source. Total cost of the planting, $253. She had spent 2 weeks of daylight hours and $253 on an experiment that her brother-in-law had told her was going to ruin her pastures. By the end of May of 1982, 63 of the saplings were dead, 15% loss. Higher than she had budgeted for, higher than Dr. Bro had estimated. The problem was cattle. Margaret had known the saplings would need protection from her cows for the first 2 years, and she had built small wire mesh cages around each one, tomato cages, essentially, made from hog wire she had bought on sale in Cuero. But the cows had figured out the cages. They had worked their heads under the bottom edge and stripped the lower leaves off anything they could reach. The damage wasn't always fatal, but it was frequent, and the saplings that had been damaged repeatedly lost the ability to photosynthesize enough to survive. Then a small drought came. June of 1982. 23 days without rain. Temperatures over 100 degrees for 19 of them. Margaret drove the water drum out twice a week and watered each surviving sapling by hand. It took her 2 full days each time. Her hands cracked. The truck's alternator went out on the 4th trip. On the evening of July 6, 1982, Ray drove up to her house unannounced. "Margaret," he said, "I've been meaning to say this for a while. I drove through the south pasture today. Those trees are dying, Maggie. Half of them are dead. You can see it from the road. Some are dying," she said. "Not half." "Maggie." He stopped. He took off his cap. He rubbed his face. "Maggie, I told Frank 20 years ago that his wife was smarter than she let on. I'm saying this to you now because I was his brother and he would want me to say it. You're running yourself into the ground over some trees from Argentina. You've got a good ranch. You've got good cattle. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, not to me, not to Frank, not to anyone in Gonzales County. Ray, I'm not trying to prove anything." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm planting trees." He looked at her for a long time. "You're a stubborn woman, Margaret." "I am." He left. He didn't come back for 6 months. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook in front of her. She read Hector's records again, the ones her father had written down in 1961. The numbers were clear. The system worked. In Corrientes, it had worked. In the south of Spain, it had worked. In the Pampas, it had worked. She was not wrong. She was only in month 3 of a 7-year plan. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She was back in the pasture at 5 the next morning. By the end of 1982, 329 saplings had survived. Over the winter of 1982 and 83, she replaced the 71 that had died. Calvin Ruiz sold her the replacements at cost, 35 cents each, and drove them out to the ranch himself, because he had never sold 400 trees to anyone in his life, and the ones she had planted were now the largest single commercial Eucalyptus camaldulensis planting in the state of Texas. By the summer of 1983, the saplings were averaging 5 feet tall. By the summer of 1984, 9 feet. By the summer of 1985, 15 feet, with canopy spreads of 8 to 12 feet. Margaret had stopped watering them after the first 12 months. The trees' taproots had reached the subsoil moisture that her grasses couldn't access. They were drawing water from 6, 8, 10 feet down. They were drawing nitrogen from the deep soil and depositing it on the surface in the form of leaf litter. The grass underneath the trees, and in a 15-foot radius around each tree, was visibly greener than the grass in the open. Margaret measured this. She took forage samples twice a year and had them analyzed at Texas A&M for crude protein content. The protein was 3 to 4 percentage points higher under the trees than in the open pasture. In the fall of 1985, she weighed her calf crop for the first time against the previous 4 years' records. Her steers were averaging 61 pounds heavier at the same age. In 1986, 94 pounds heavier. In 1987, 147 pounds heavier. The cattle were finishing faster. They were staying cooler in the summer heat. They were drinking less water. They were gaining weight on less feed. But the other ranchers in Gonzales County didn't see any of that. They saw a widow with trees in her pasture. They saw a ranch that looked different from theirs. A few of them noticed that her calf weights at the Cuero auction had been trending upward. Most of them didn't notice anything. They were busy with their own problems. Beef prices were soft through 1986 and 87. Interest rates were still high. 3 ranches in the county had gone under between 1984 and 1987. The county was watching other things. It was watching the weather. Because the rain had started to get thin by the spring of 1987. And by the fall of 1987, the stock tanks were lower than they should have been. And by the spring of 1988, every old rancher in Gonzales County was saying the same thing at the Dairy Queen and the feed store and the Methodist church parking lot. This one's going to be bad. The drought of 1988 started quietly. A dry March, a drier April. Spring rains that were supposed to bring 8 inches brought 2. The native grass that should have been knee-high by May was ankle-high and already starting to brown at the tips. By June, the cattle tanks were down 2 feet. By July, they were down 4. The Guadalupe River, which ran along the eastern edge of the county, was the lowest it had been since 1956. The hay barns were empty. Hay that had sold for $3 a bale the previous September was now selling for $9 in the few places you could still find it. The supplemental feed bills were crushing. The ranchers who had expanded in the late 70s, who had taken on notes when cattle prices were high, started making hard decisions. Sell early, sell light, sell to the auction in Cuero at whatever the buyers would pay. Dale Purdy sold 120 head of his best breeding stock in June. He got 48 cents a pound. His father had bought those cows' grandmothers in 1961. Emmett Craddock in DeWitt County sold 83 head in July. Louisa Reyes in Fayette sold her entire calf crop in July, 2 months early, because she couldn't afford the feed to finish them. The holding company from Houston, the 3 lawyers who had bought 4 ranches in the county in the mid-'80s, offered Thomas Boudreau in Karnes County $17 an acre for his grass lease. And he took it because his alternative was selling cattle. Lowell Watts was in the worst shape of anyone. He was 66 years old in the summer of 1988. He ran 640 acres outside of Smiley. He had been farming and ranching in Gonzales County since he was 19. By the middle of July, his stock tanks were dry. His Hereford cattle were standing in the sun at the empty tanks, heads down, waiting for water that wasn't coming. He was hauling water in a 1,200-gallon trailer from a well on the neighbor's place. And he was filling the troughs twice a day, and the cattle were drinking it faster than he could bring it. His grass was gone. His hay was gone. His checkbook was gone. He sold 60 head on July 22nd, 42 cents a pound, less than he had paid for them as calves 3 years earlier. He was going to lose the ranch. Every rancher in the county knew it. He knew it himself. He just had not said the words out loud yet. Then one morning in early August, Lowell Watts was driving back from the feed store in Cuero with a load of range cubes he couldn't really afford. He took the county road that ran past Margaret Holloway's south fence line. He had driven that road probably 4,000 times in his life. He had never once stopped on it. But on this particular morning, he stopped. Because what he saw on the other side of her fence did not make sense. Margaret's south pasture was green, not bright green, not lush, but green. The grass was 6 inches tall. It had seed heads. It had color. Her cattle were grazing in the middle of the morning, which no other cattle in the county were doing, because no other cattle in the county had the energy. They had moved from shade to grass to water and back again on their own schedule. Lowell saw at least 40 head of Margaret's brangus standing in the shade of a cluster of eucalyptus near the middle of the pasture. The trees were 30 feet tall by then. They cast a cool, broken shade across maybe a 1/4 acre of ground each. The cattle under them looked relaxed. Their ears were forward. They were chewing their cud. Lowell Watts got out of his truck. He walked to the fence. He stood there looking for a long time. He looked at the trees. He looked at the grass. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the ground under the trees, which was the darkest, greenest grass on the whole pasture. He looked at his own arm, which was already starting to sweat in the 9 in the morning heat, and he looked at the cattle standing in that broken shade, and he understood something that he did not want to understand. He drove to his own ranch. He stood at his own fence line and looked at his own cattle. They were standing in the open sun because there was no shade to stand in. They were panting. Their heads were down. The water in the trough was already warm. The grass was gone. The ground was cracking. He drove back to Margaret's place. He parked on the county road. He stood at her gate for almost an hour. He did not go in. He did not honk. He did not call out. He just stood at the gate and looked at her pasture and watched her cattle move around under those trees like it was any other summer in any other year. Margaret saw him from the kitchen window. She didn't go out to meet him. After a while, he got back in his truck and drove away. By the middle of August of 1988, word had spread about Margaret Holloway's pastures. It was a different kind of word than the laughter of 1982. This word was quiet. Ranchers started driving past her place. Some of them parked on the shoulder of the county road and just looked. Some of them got out and stood at her fence line. One morning she counted 6 pickup trucks on the road between her front gate and the Smiley turnoff. Not one of them came to her door. Not one of them called out. They just looked. They were looking at the thing they had been refusing to see for 6 years. The first man to come to her door was a man named Hollis Coatsworth. He was not a neighbor. He was the district livestock agent for the Texas Agricultural Extension Service, a man who covered 4 counties and had been doing the job for 19 years. Hollis had been hearing about Margaret's pastures for almost 2 years. He had finally made time to drive out in April, before the drought had fully set in, and he had spent 3 hours walking her trees and asking her questions and filling a notebook with data. He had promised her he would bring researchers out from Texas A&M. He had done it in May, 6 of them, 2 days on the ranch. Soil samples, forage analysis, photographs, interviews. He drove back out to see her on August 15th, 1988. "Margaret," he said when she opened the door. "I don't know if you've been into town much." "No," Margaret said. "I've been here. People are driving out here. I know. They're looking at your pastures from the road. I know. Have you talked to any of them?" "No." She made him coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. Hollis was 47 years old. He had a master's degree from Texas A&M. He had spent his career trying to convince ranchers in South Texas to try silvopasture, and he had been laughed out of more meetings than he wanted to remember. He looked at Margaret across her kitchen table and he said, "Mrs. Holloway, I think this drought is going to end up being the thing that finally makes them listen." He paused. "I have been thinking about why, and I think it's because no number on paper was ever going to convince a Texas rancher that trees belong in a pasture. But this is not a number on paper. This is their cattle dying in the sun while your cattle are grazing in the shade. They can see it from the road. You can't argue with something you can see from the road." Margaret drank her coffee. "When the rain comes back," she said, "they'll forget. Some will, not all." He looked at her. "Margaret, what you have built out here, you know what it is, right? I know what it is. It is going to change how South Texas ranches. Not overnight, not in 5 years. But it is going to change. I know. Would you let me bring a reporter out from the San Antonio paper?" "I'd rather not." Hollis nodded. He understood. But 3 weeks later, a reporter came out anyway. She had called Hollis first. Hollis had called Margaret. Margaret had said no at first, then had said yes, because the reporter was a woman named Elena Ortiz, whose grandfather had been a ranch foreman in Duval County, and who had grown up listening to stories about cattle and grass and drought. The article ran on September 4th, 1988, on the front page of the business section of the San Antonio Express News. The headline read, "In the drought's worst summer, one Gonzales County rancher still has green grass." Under the headline was a photograph of Margaret, standing at the edge of her south pasture with 3 of her Brangus steers in the middle distance and the 30-foot eucalyptus trees rising behind them into a clear Texas sky. The phone started ringing the day the article ran. It didn't stop for a month. Margaret answered some of the calls. She let most of them go. The ones she answered were from ranchers in other counties who wanted to come see the trees. She let them come. She walked them through the pastures. She answered their questions. She didn't charge them anything. Between September of 1988 and March of 1989, 112 ranchers from 14 Texas counties walked her pastures. Some of them placed orders with Calvin Ruiz. Calvin sold more eucalyptus saplings in those 6 months than he had sold in the previous 15 years combined. He called Margaret in March of 1989, the day he made his 20,000th sapling sale. He said, "Margaret, I don't know what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything, Calvin. I do. I came here from Argentina in 1968 with a suitcase and 7 pounds of eucalyptus seed. I had been trying to sell these trees for 14 years when you walked up to my table in Yoakum. I was going to quit after that auction. I was going to stop propagating. I was going to sell the greenhouse. I know. Margaret, you bought those trees because you already knew what they were. I know. But you bought them on a day when I had decided that no one in Texas was ever going to know. You kept something alive that almost died that day. The same way you kept the trees alive through your first summer." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "We kept each other alive, Calvin," she said. "That's what the good systems do." By the spring of 1989, Texas A&M had opened a formal research program on silvopasture based on Margaret's ranch. Dr. Karen Whitmore, the soil scientist who had visited in May of '88, was running it. She asked Margaret if she would co-author a paper with her. Margaret said no to the co-authorship, but yes to contributing her data. The paper came out in 1990 in the Journal of Range Management. It became the most cited paper on temperate silvopasture for the next 15 years. Margaret was never listed as a co-author at her insistence. She was named in the acknowledgments as a cooperating producer. That was enough for her. She was not in the business of being famous. She was in the business of raising cattle. Ray came back in October of 1988. He had not been to the ranch since the spring of 1983, when he and Margaret had had a second hard conversation about the trees, and he had decided to stop coming out. 5.5 years of silence between them. He drove up on a Saturday morning. Margaret was in the south pasture fixing a cross brace. She saw his truck pull up. She walked out to meet him. "Ray," she said. "Maggie." He had his cap in his hand. He was looking past her at the eucalyptus trees in the pasture. He did not say anything for a long moment. "I read the article," he said. "I thought you might." He cleared his throat. "Frank was wrong," he said. "About what?" "About what I'd say if he planted trees." Margaret didn't answer. "If Frank had planted trees in '68, I would have come around. It would have taken me a few years, but I would have come around. I know you would have, Ray. I'm sorry I didn't come around sooner. It's all right. I've been sitting at the Dairy Queen for 6 years, making jokes I shouldn't have made. It's all right, Ray. It's not all right. But I appreciate you saying it." He looked at the trees again. "Frank would have loved this. He would have. He died too young, Maggie." "He did." Ray stood there for another long moment. Then he said, "Can I walk the pastures with you? You don't have to ask." He walked the pastures with her. They were out there for 3 hours. She showed him the spacing pattern. She showed him how the leaf litter had built up around each tree. She showed him the soil sample holes where Texas A&M had taken cores. She showed him the newest trees, the ones she had planted along the north fence line the previous spring. Ray asked good questions. He had run cattle his whole life. He understood grass. He understood soil. He had just never imagined it working this way. At the end of the walk, he said, "Maggie, how many can I get from Calvin Ruiz?" "You can get as many as you want, Ray. I'll call him Monday." She put her hand on his arm for a second. "Welcome back, Ray. I'm sorry I was gone so long." Margaret Holloway ran the ranch for another 16 years after the drought of 1988. The ranch did not triple in size. Margaret never wanted a bigger ranch. She wanted a better one. She expanded the silver pasture planting to cover 660 acres by the time she stopped the major plantings in 1994. She raised Brangus cattle the same way she had when Frank was alive, on the same land, in the same pastures, using the same ledger system her mother had taught her at the cafe in San Antonio in 1956. Her cattle continued to weigh more than the county average every year for the rest of her active career. In the drought of 1998, which was worse than 1988 in some counties, she lost 3% of her herd. The county average that year was 21%. In 2011, the worst Texas drought on record, she would have been vindicated all over again, but by then she had been retired for 7 years. Her niece, Gloria Castellanos Reyna, was running the ranch. Gloria had been working summers on the ranch since she was 19. Gloria was Eduardo Castellanos' great-granddaughter, through a cousin's line. She was the last member of the Castellanos family with agricultural roots. Margaret had picked her deliberately. In 2004, when Margaret was 62, she handed the operation to Gloria. She built a smaller house on the east side of the property for herself. She kept the original ranch house for Gloria and her family. She kept the Alice Chalmers and the F-250, even though the F-250 hadn't run since 2001. She kept the composition notebooks, all of them. The one her father had written in Corrientes in 1961, the one she had used to map the planting in 1982, the one she had used to record the weights and the soil samples and the rainfall from 1983 through 2004. She kept them in the drawer in the kitchen, where Frank had kept them 37 years earlier. In 2007, the Texas Cattlemen's Association gave her a Lifetime Achievement Award. She did not attend the ceremony. She sent Gloria in her place, with a written statement that Gloria read to the crowd of 900 ranchers. The statement was 2 sentences long. It said, "My father told me in 1963 that Texas ranchers don't plant trees. He was right about the ranchers. He was wrong about the trees." When Gloria finished reading it, the crowd was quiet for a long moment. Then they stood up and applauded for over a minute. Margaret heard about it from Gloria when she came home that night. She smiled. She asked how the food had been. Gloria's son is 15 years old. His name is Mateo. He speaks Spanish at home with his great-aunt, who lives in the smaller house, and is 82 years old, and as sharp as she has ever been. Mateo knows every one of the trees Margaret planted in 1982 by number. He has the original composition notebook in a drawer in his bedroom. He knows each tree's location on the map, its growth rate, the year it stopped needing extra water. Last spring, Gloria put Mateo on the Alice Chalmers for the first time. He was 15, the same age Margaret had been when she first went to Argentina with her father. Mateo started the tractor. It caught on the second crank, the way it had caught for 42 years. He drove it out to the south pasture to check fence lines. Gloria watched him go. She said quietly, to no one in particular, "Trees in a pasture are an insurance policy against the years when everything else fails." The same words Hector Castellanos had said to Margaret in Corrientes in 1961. The same words Eduardo Castellanos had said to his daughter in 1963. The same words Margaret had said to Gloria in 1996. The same words Gloria was now saying to her son on a Texas afternoon in 2024. 4 generations. 1 sentence. 1 insurance policy. 1 ranch that stayed green through 3 droughts because a woman planted 400 trees in a cow pasture while the whole county was laughing. What do you see when you look at a eucalyptus tree in a Texas pasture? Most people see something out of place, something decorative, something that belongs in a suburban yard, not on a working ranch. The county saw a grieving widow. The nurseryman saw a sale he almost refused to make. The brother-in-law saw a woman running her dead husband's ranch into the ground. Lowell Watts saw a tree farmer pretending to be a rancher. Then the drought came, and everyone saw the same thing. They saw green grass in a brown summer. They saw cattle in the shade when every other cow in the county was standing in the sun. They saw a ranch that had built its own insurance policy 6 years before the storm came. Margaret Holloway saw 400 saplings from Corrientes that she had been carrying in a composition notebook since 1961. She saw a soil survey that matched a piece of land 6,000 miles away. She saw her father's voice telling her, in 1963, that Texas ranchers don't plant trees. And she heard underneath it the question he hadn't asked out loud, which was whether his daughter would. She saw what her father's cousin had built in Corrientes, and what her father had been too careful to try in Texas, and what her husband had been too afraid to plant in 1968. Everyone else saw decorative trees. She saw the thing her family had been waiting 4 generations to build. That's the difference between someone who follows a county's wisdom and someone who follows her own. Margaret Holloway planted 400 eucalyptus trees in March of 1982 for $160. 6 years later, the worst drought in 40 years burned through South Texas, and her cattle were the only ones in Gonzales County still grazing in green grass. And the men who had laughed at her in 1982 stood at her fence line in silence. And nobody understood why. Not because the why was hidden, but because the why had been sitting in a composition notebook in her kitchen drawer for 21 years, waiting for the year the rain wouldn't come, waiting for the moment when the only person left to ask permission from was herself. 400 saplings, a widow, a composition notebook from 1961. The trees that nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody took seriously, until the drought came and everyone saw what had grown in 6 years on Texas grass.